Assalamualaikum. Today we will be discussing the hierarchy of courts in Malaysia, and together with me, Dina Alim Designer, is Muhammad Afiq Ahmed. The first era was in pre-1985, in which the Privy Council was the highest in the hierarchy of courts, followed by the Federal Court, and then the High Court of Malaya, which was also the same level as the High Court of Borneo. The second era was in 1985 until 1994, in which the Federal Court was renamed as the Supreme Court due to the effect on January 1st, 1985, under the Constitution Act 1983. So the hierarchy of Malaysian superior courts were changed again, with the highest court during that time being the Federal Court, and followed by two high courts, which are the High Court in Malaya and also in Borneo. The doctrine of stare decisis means that in cases where the material facts are the same, a court must follow the prior decisions of higher courts, or prior decisions of its own, and also prior decisions of a court of the same level, whether past or present, in the same hierarchy. So the doctrine of stare decisis therefore has a two-way operation, which one is horizontal and the other one is vertical. During the first era, which was pre-1985, in which the Privy Council was the highest in the hierarchy of Malaysian courts, although they maintained their positions until the 31st of December 1984, the court never really considered itself bound by their own decisions. So therefore, the two high courts were bound by the decisions of the Federal Court, while the Federal Court stood by itself. During the second era, although the Federal Court was renamed as the Supreme Court, its position and jurisdictions remained the same. Hence, the two high courts in Malaya and Borneo were bound to the doctrine of the stare decisis, which they had to follow the decisions made by the Supreme Court, as it was the final court of appeal. And so for the third era, where the three-tier structure was then reinstated again, the Court of Appeal was standing in the middle of the two high courts and the apex court, which was the Supreme Court, which was renamed to Federal Court again. And so the decisions made by the Federal Court binds all of the courts. So the Court of Appeal is bound by the decisions of the Federal Court, and its decisions bind the two high courts. So basically, every court in the hierarchy must follow the prior decisions of courts higher than them. So now we are going to discuss the application of the doctrine horizontally between all the three eras, which we will start with the first and the second era. So by referring to both eras, it comes to a concern whether the Supreme Court, which has been renamed in the second era, was bound by the practice and precedents of the Federal Court in the first era. So the answer to this can be found in the case of Government of Malaysia and UEM and Lim Kit Siang in the year of 1988. So undoubtedly, this decision indicates that the Supreme Court did not consider itself bound by the decision of the Federal Court in the first era. So for the first and third era, the question that may arise is whether the present Federal Court is bound by its own decisions in the first era of Federal Court. So this can actually be divided into two discussions, which are civil and criminal matters. And as for the criminal, the present Federal Court is actually not bound by its own previous decisions. One example case is the case of Arup Ghassan against public prosecutor in the year of 1997, which illustrates the departure of the Federal Court from its own previous decision. As for civil matters, it's actually pretty similar to criminal cases, namely, while treating previous decisions to be normally binding, the Federal Court will depart from a previous decision when it appears right to do so. So this can be seen in the case of Koperasi Rakyat against Harta Empat in the year of 2000. For the second and the third era, as we are all well aware, the present Federal Court is the successor of the Supreme Court, and as such, it is bound by the decision of the latter. Nevertheless, in civil matters, the Federal Court actually regards itself as not bound by the decision of the Supreme Court in the second era, as seen in the case of Malaysian National Insurance and Lim Kyo in the year of 1997, as opposed to criminal matters, which the Federal Court holds itself bound by the decisions of the Supreme Court, and this can be seen in the case of Tan Boon Keen against the public prosecutor in the year 1995, where eventually the Federal Court unanimously held itself bound by the Supreme Court's decision. So the next issue will be relating to the Privy Council, whether or not its decision were binding on other Malaysian courts. And so believe it or not, the decisions made by the Privy Council before the abolishment are still in effect and will continue to be binding on all Malaysian courts, excluding the Federal Court. So this is due to the fact that when the judgments were delivered, they were construed into the applicable law in Malaysia in view of its nature as illustrated in the case of Wong Si Leng, thus accounted as part of the Malaysian jurisprudence. The last issue will be relating to the Federal Court in the first era, whether it's bound by its own decision. Basically, the practice of the Federal Court followed the Court of Appeal in England, and so in civil cases, its practice was based on the English Court of Appeal, where the precedent should be followed. And this is evident in the case of Central Securities against Harun bin Muhammad Zaidi, whereas in criminal cases, the Federal Court, like the English Court of Appeal, did not regard itself as strictly bound by its own decisions. This can be seen vividly in the case of Oi Hee Koi against public prosecutor.
The Federal Court in this era was established on 16 September 1963 under Malaysian Act 1963. Discussing the issues related to this Federal Court in this first era, whether it's bound by its own decision or not. Basically, the practice of the Federal Court followed of the Court of Appeal in England. In civil cases, its practice was based on English Court of Appeal, where the precedent should be followed. This is evident in the case of Central Securities holding Berhad v Harun bin Muhammad Zaidi 1980. Whereas, in criminal cases, the Federal Court, like the English Court of Appeal Criminal Division, did not regard itself strictly bound by its own precedents or decisions. It can be seen in the case of Oi Hee Koi v Public Prosecutor 1966. Section 69, subsection 4 of the Court of Judicature Act 1964, Act 91, that the Supreme Court, when exercising its original jurisdiction under the Federal Constitution, was bound by its prior decision given. However, there is no clear answer to the question whether the Supreme Court, when exercising its appellate jurisdiction, was bound by its own precedents. So, normally, the Supreme Court follows its earlier decision. However, it also has the right to depart from its decision where it would appear to be right to do so. The decision made by the Federal Court binds all the courts, which means the Court of Appeal is bound by the decision of the Federal Court. The Court of Appeal is bound to follow the decision by the Federal Court, but the decisions made in the Court of Appeal bind all high courts in Malaya and Sabah and Sarawak. So that's all from us from Group 2. Hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you.